Hello, everybody, and welcome to In Conversation, the podcast where we speak with thought leaders, scholars, authors, and various different intellect partners shaping the future of academic publishing and the creative industries. I'm your host, James Campbell, and today I'm joined by Tony O'Rourke, the commercial director of Enago, a global leader in language editing and publication support for researchers and institutions alike. Tony, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
James, pleasure to be here. Just to correct you, if I may, I'm not actually commercial director. I'm vice president of partnerships, so I look after our relationships with publishers as part of the commercial team.
Well, as always, need to fact check and proofread these things. We've done a better job of that earlier on. Classic.
It's the same thing.
Well, it's one of the reasons we have publishing partners like yourselves, isn't it? Of course, to make sure that we don't make too many mistakes over on our side.
That's the plan.
Yeah. Well, look, let's jump right in, Tony. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you? How did you get into this trade? And then we'll jump in and to learn a little bit more about Enago in general.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm Tony O'Rourke, and as I say, I work for a company. Well, I actually work for a company called Crimson Interactive, which has a number of brands, Enago being one of those. I'll talk about who we are in a moment. I've been in publishing my entire career, and I've been in academic publishing since the early 90s, mostly into commercial roles. I've worked for organizations like ProQuest, or what is now ProQuest, I suppose, what is now Clarivate, really, because they got bought, didn't they? And I've also worked in straight academic publishing. I worked for the Institute of Physics for a number of years as their sales and marketing director. I was responsible for growing the portfolio of scientific journals and content. And then after that, I was a commercial director for the Royal College of Nursing's publishing business. So a lot of experience in the healthcare space. And since 2018, have been working with Crimson Interactive as a parent company for Enago. And we are a specialist in providing I suppose academic language services is the best way of describing it, but that's from simple editing right through to sort of technology, AI tools to support any aspect of the content creation workflow. Wow.
Okay. You've had quite the career in publishing then.
Yeah, I have. I had hair when I started. So no, I started off in magazine and sort of trade book publishing with a Dutch company. But I've only really ever worked in the publishing space. 40 plus years now.
Oh, there's hope for me then, because I think I'm about 18 years deep and people are telling me you're crazy, you need to get out of that trade. And I said, no, in it for life.
Well, I don't know. Everyone's different, but I couldn't see myself working in any other sector. The people are the most interesting, most engaged. You're meeting some extraordinary people just in terms of their knowledge and experience. No, it's been a wonderful career.
Well, that's great to hear. Gives me hope for the future. And you're dead right. I think we do get to work with and meet some fantastic people here. And no doubt now that you've moved over to Enago, that continues to be the case.
Absolutely no different. In fact, it's great because I'm now dealing with every academic discipline, not intellects, obviously in the arts and humanities very strongly, but also working a lot in the social sciences and economics, business law, and hard sciences, and some really, really bright, engaging, and challenging from terms of managing a business perspective. People, really great bunch to be working with.
Well, let me ask you another question about Enago then. For anyone who's listening who maybe isn't familiar with Enago, which I imagine quite a few of our listeners, but I think many of them will actually benefit from hearing a bit more about the services you offer. But before we delve a bit too deep into those services, can you just tell us a bit more about your kind of core mission? And kind of what are the main kind of communities that you see yourself serving?
Okay, so we are a global language services business. So what does that mean? That's our job is to work with researchers who are creating content, whether that's a book chapter, an article for a scientific journal, a conference paper. It could be a preprint that they're submitting to some preprint service somewhere. We started as a business that helped authors to improve the quality of the language for any content that they're writing. Now, bear in mind, you've got something like 20 million knowledge workers around the world, of which about 25 to 30% are creating content at any one time, submitting articles to journals or book chapters, whatever. And of that 4 or 5 million, you're probably at best 25% at most where English is the first language. And of course, as we all know, English is the lingua franca of research, ironically, but then I've mentioned the Italian word to describe it. It's the official language for scientific communication. That wasn't always the case, but it is now. So not only do you have to be good at your science, not only do you have to be good at communicating the science in your own language, you also got to be good at communicating your science in a second language. So I suppose what we try and do is to help break down barriers or knock over hurdles. So yeah, an article is submitted to a journal might get rejected because it's just not good enough, or it's out of scope, or whatever it might be, but it won't get rejected because of the way you've written it. It might be rejected by what you've written. It may just be not appropriate, but it won't get rejected for language. So our guarantee to authors, and I suppose our mission, is to help authors through that stage of the process. And if they want help further down the line as well, if they have to resubmit or if they have to rewrite the article, we have tools available to them that can help them there. So it's about helping the author. And of course, that's extended into helping publishers who are working with authors like Intellect, who are working with authors who have got authors who are submitting content all the time to their journals, who just need a little bit of care and attention in how they're submitting their paper, what they're submitting, to give them the best possible chance in peer review. In terms of the communities that we serve, as I say, it's global. So I'd say a good 2/3 of our business is Asia. And not just Asia, we're talking about China, Japan, Singapore, Korea, Malaysia, all those East Asian countries, as well as the Middle East. I'm more likely to get an inquiry or a conversation with I don't know, a physics researcher in Saudi Arabia than I would a researcher from the US or the UK. It's really a global requirement.
And obviously Intellect's like more of an arts and humanities publisher, although we do flirt with the sciences from time to time.
Yeah.
Are you seeing more scholars from places like the Middle East and East Asia and Asia in general, working in areas around the arts and humanities as well as sciences, needing your services as well? Is that something you're seeing developing and shift?
In a lot of countries, unfortunately, maybe for the arts and humanities, there is an emphasis on the STEM subjects. So right. you might find there's more funding available, there always is more funding available in the STEM subjects.
Unfortunately, yeah, that's definitely the case.
A lot of universities will be agnostic as to, if they're going to support these programs, who and how these programs will be used. So they don't necessarily specify we're only supporting maths, or we're only supporting physics, or we're only supporting medicine. They'll say if an arrangement is being funded by a university or by a research office, then it tends to be agnostic. So we have an arrangement with a university in, let's say, Hungary, where it's absolutely open to anybody who meets the criteria. Are you going to be an early career researcher in this particular case? You're writing in what they consider to be a higher impact journal. Here's a long list, which includes humanities and social sciences subjects. So as long as it fits their criteria, then there's no reason why they wouldn't use our service. But the honest answer though is, I don't think about 10 to 15% is arts and humanities for us. It's the lowest proportion. But we're still talking about tens of thousands of articles every year that we receive from authors in those sectors.
Well, I mean, that's exactly the same with us. Although we're solely really focused on the arts, humanities, and social sciences, not really the hard sciences. There's thousands of articles coming our way each year, but we're always the areas that are often underfunded, the first to be sort of defunded, if you will. But of course, at the moment, potentially one of the most important subjects as well, and the most important groups of subjects in terms of our ability to kind of communicate what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
But I digress. Let me ask you another question. What does it look like for one of these scholars? Let's say someone who wants to submit to an Intellect journal, they want to utilize your services. What's that process look like, and how would they kind of go about submitting? And maybe you could tell us a bit about how you would help get their manuscript ready.
So a typical scenario: why would an author use our service? An author would use our service because they've prepared a document. It could be typically it's a journal article, but it could be a book chapter that they've written in English, where the standard English has to be at the right level, and they want somebody not just to edit the article, they want somebody who's got the right kind of academic background to edit the article. So we have our promise is that you'll have at least one editor read the content, is native English speaking, who has got the background in your subject area, whether it's any aspect of it. Could be I think we covered something like 1,350 different microdisciplines, and every major humanities and social arts and humanities discipline will be covered in some way. Some areas are more popular than others, of course, as you can imagine, but it's very simple. If I'm just going to share my screen, if the author goes to this site, can you see my screen?
I can.
If they visit this site, they will get a 20% discount on the cost of editing. They could come to enago.com directly and they just pay our standard retail prices. But if they come to this site, which is an Enago Intellects co-branded site, that our systems will identify you come from the site, will recognize the URL, and then you will automatically receive a 20% reduction on the typical cost of editing. So as long as they place their order or make their inquiry through this site, that will ensure that their article, the pricing is as low as it can be.
And what's the kind of process entail? So just to give people an idea of, once they've kind of submitted, once they've engaged with the site and the platform, maybe you could, you were alluding then a little bit that you have experts, native English speakers from a lot of different fields. I think that would be a big thing that people would be concerned about. So, to make sure that their work is not only being read by someone like a native English speaker, but it's not just me and you who are going through it. It is a bona fide expert, a true peer within the field. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that process.
I'll give you a practical example. Let's take visual arts as a typical area.
Okay.
So we have something like, there's 2,000 plus specialist freelance editors who are subject editors in their own right. Okay, and that covers every discipline. And in the visual arts, they've got to have at least, 85% of PhD qualified, so they're teaching or have been involved in some academic way in this content. 85% of PhD. We have got some who are master's level, but have got a lot of experience in editing content in their areas. So if you take someone like the visual arts, we'll have editors who are specialists in things like art conservation, art history, filmmaking, film studies, fine arts, painting, sculpture, photography, sculpture. They've got not just an interest, but they've got an academic background in that space. So the content that we receive from the author, we match the subject of that paper to a specialist editor. He or she then edits the paper from a language flow, just improves the way the article is presented. A second editor will then look at the content, and he or she may not necessarily be a subject editor, but they're a specialist editor. So they'll take the content and just make sure that all the dots and commas and full stops are in place as it should be. So what the author will get back will be typically it's a Word document. We can do it in other top formats as well, like LaTeX or PDF, but typically it's a Word document with track changes, which the author can then go through and decide which of those changes they want to accept or reject. And most times they just accept the whole thing, but there are times that they might disagree with a change that an editor's made, and then that's the point at which they then send the paper to the publisher, to Intellect, for example. So now, you write the paper, upload the paper to the site I shared. That's then allocated to a subject editor, and then a specialist editor sees it. Two editors will always see the paper, and then it's returned to the author as a tracked doc file.
Okay, I mean, so very much adhering to the rigors expected of academic publishing. Simply to the peer review process itself, it sounds like a very straightforward sort of tracking system, which would make sense to a lot of our authors and editors who will have submitted to peer review journals before. It seems very in line with.
And the important thing to stress is there are lots of organisations that will do editing, and they're perfectly good organisations, but they won't always have access to specialist academic editors, and that's kind of one of the things that sets us up. There are a few of us like that, but people like us sets us apart, that we're not just doing editing, we're doing academic editing, academic level editing. Our authors are academics, they've got an academic background, and they've also been editors themselves. So there's a lot of experienced editors working with us. And so we're up over 2,000 that we work with.
I mean, I think it's also just worth highlighting here that, of course, I'm sure you'll use AI-powered tools and various different things, but it sounds to me like that they are, they complement the human-centered approach, which sounds to me like that's very pivotal for Enago.
Yeah, and we've been working with AI tools since 2015. We have a range of tools that we use internally to help manage our processes. So one of the things we have is a tool which tries to tries to assess the level of language used in an article.
Gotcha.
And depending on how good or how bad the article is, they'll also reflect the kind of editors that they might need. And those tools are being used by publishers, for example, as part of their own editing process. So, they're not over editing a content, or they've quickly identify which papers need the most care and attention by using this tool. So we have tools that identify copy editing levels. We have tools that do AI-based editing as well, but as part of an overall workflow. So it'll be there'll be human guardrails, there'll be human editors that work with them. For the process that we have for intellect papers, for authors submitting to intellect journals, it's exclusively human. So it's human editors that will review the process. But there's, an author could come to us and use an AI editing tool, which then would require human intervention.
There's obviously a positive ethical component to this, and I was wondering how you would see Enago contributing to, the greater ethical and inclusive nature of academic publishing as things develop over the next few years, especially around, authorship and voice and retaining those kinds of things.
It's not so much around authorship and voice. It's more where we feel we're contributing is in terms of research integrity. Every publisher now has an expectation that if an author is using AI, for example, to help them to generate content, that they disclose AI or how they've used AI, or at least at the very least they disclose AI. So we launched about 6 months ago. We haven't promoted it perhaps as widely as we should, because still a lot of people haven't heard of it. This thing called the Responsible AI Movement. And the Responsible AI Movement is to help everyone within that kind of ecosystem, everyone within that content chain, whether it's the publisher, the editor, the author, the reviewer, to know or to understand or appreciate what does best practice look like when using AI to help in the process of content generation. How much should you acknowledge and disclose? Where have you used the tools? Which tools have you used? So there's kind of we feel very strongly that it should almost be like standards in place. That, if an author says to a publisher, okay, I've used standard A, standard B in the preparation of my text, if this means something, they know which tools they've used, why they've used them, how it's used. It hasn't interfered with the research results. It may have helped in generating images or tables or abstracts, whatever. But they are very clear by those standards how AI has been used. So I think one of the things we feel we're adding is trying to take away some of the lack of appreciation for AI, because AI is here. There's no two ways about it. AI is absolutely here. Authors in every subject area using this, but trying to establish some ground rule in terms of what does best practice look like. And so helping organizations like the STM Trade Association done a lot of work in the space, for example, the Committee on Publication Ethics, in terms of establishing what best practice should be.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because it feels like, again, I'm not an expert on AI, but it does feel like the AI is a little bit like the Wild West at the moment. And that's partly because it's developing so quickly, and partly because there's not necessarily that many global regulations that businesses
there is no global regulation.
sign up to, right? So it's almost like academic partners, companies, people like yourself that are almost leading the way in many respects in what's the ethical use.
I'll give you a really good example as well. I was at a conference earlier this year in the US called it's the Association for College and Research Libraries. So it's very much a research library conference.
Right.
And I was talking to librarians there who were obviously having to deal with AI matters all the time. And this one university in Michigan, I think it was, or Illinois, one of those states, big university, who were saying, look, here's my dilemma. She's a librarian. Here's my dilemma. I've got, on one hand, the school of, let's say, philosophy or theology or film studies, who are absolutely banning the use of AI. They're saying, look, how are you going to learn if you're using AI to create this content? And next door, in the business building or in the marketing school or in the economics department, they're mandating the use of AI.
Yeah.
So you've got to use these tools.
Yeah.
This is what you're going to be using in the workplace. How do they bring those two together? So it's managing that balance, and there is a kind of a real kind of split between this. In fact, in subject in terms of what good use of AI should be, but there are some great examples of how AI can be used properly, intelligently, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I think of it as like it's a tool, and I think that there's probably a lot of irrational fear out there, and I don't know. I mean, obviously, within the general populace, you know, there's a lot of hyperbole, and people certainly like to go down the Terminator route, as I like to think of it. But in reality, alas, we're probably not really quite down the Terminator route. But what do you see a lot of like misconceptions and irrational fears from the academic community around AI, or do you think that these fears are well placed, or do you see that they're well, you know, do you see people's concerns and do they make sense to you, or do you find this we're still in this kind of slight like Terminator mode where people are like it's going to take over the world?
Well, yeah. I think there is generally there's still a lot of question marks in every aspect of whether it's the dean setting the standards for their universities, whether it's the heads of department, you know, trying to give guidance in terms of how courses should be put together, how course materials should be put together, the individual lecturers are putting the material together. You know, there is an inconsistency, you know, standards, how students should be using AI. You know, we launched a product about 6 months ago called DocuMark, and DocuMark is all around helping the institution, the university, to understand with any given piece of content how much of it was cut and paste from a third-party source, how much of it was typed in manually by the author, how much of it was generated by AI. Because what they're starting to do is like they do with things like plagiarism checks, and say, look, you know, and a certain amount of plagiarism is inevitable. You know, references, citing authors, but it can't be more than X. It can't be more than 5%, 10%. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in terms of the AI. Yes, look, we accept AI is going to happen, and you might be using AI to create your abstracts or your summaries or whatever, but it can't be more than X% of the total piece of work that you hand in. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So, you know, unfortunately, there's no one answer for all academics. Everyone's individual, everyone's unique, and they all have their own individual positions. But I think it's like when I'm old enough to remember calculators being introduced for GCSEs. You know, when I did my GCSEs, it was the year calculators were introduced. Before that, we had to use log tables. Well, physical books to look up cosines and sines and tangents. You know, this is no different. You know, today it's just another tool that will help the researcher to communicate their research.
I think that's very well reasoned. So thank you for sharing your perspective. And before we jump back into Intellect and Enago's relationship, I should actually probably just say for anyone out there who doesn't know, the first journal that Intellect ever published back in 1984 was the Artificial Intelligence Review. So large language models and machine learning and AI are not new things. They've been around for a long, long time.
Oh, absolutely. Artificial intelligence goes back to the 1960s. Yeah, so, it's just the prevalence of it just feels like ChatGPT has only been here for the last couple of years, you know, and it has really in sort of the broader, wider industry sense. But we've got our own AI tools. You know, we help authors. We use authors. We help authors with their work using certain AI tools. So, you know.
Well, thank you for sharing your take on that. I thought let's just have a couple of questions about our partnership with Intellect specifically. It's great. Thanks for showing us the interface there and how that functions. But I wanted to ask you a question that kind of leads on from what you've already said. But how do you see this partnership benefiting early career researchers or first-time authors publishing with Intellect, especially on that journal level?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's perhaps break it down into, you know, early career researchers and non-early career researchers. I think actually it benefits anybody who needs help with in terms of communicating their research, and it's not just authors whose first language isn't English. I'd say about 10% of the content we get are from native English-speaking authors. You know, you can be a genius in your subject area, but you can't write to save your life. You know, so you need help in terms of how can I best express this research. So the value we add, I hope, for Intellect authors is that when they submit a paper to Intellect, they've got a journal in mind. They think it's going to reach an audience which it's going to help communicate their research and the reputation of that researcher. And you want your research to be expressed in the most effective way possible. Now, one of the steps you have to go through is peer review. Okay, so when you submit your paper to Intellect, you have to go through a peer review process. Before that peer review process takes place, there are a number of things you have to make sure as an author you get right. You know, are there formatting issues I have to deal with? I don't know with Intellect whether you're format agnostic or whether you set rules, but let's say that you don't. your article's got to be written in a clear, concise, unambiguous way, which might sound very straightforward, but if English isn't your first language, that isn't always the case.
Yeah.
So what our guarantee is, if you send us the paper, again, there's a fee associated with that. Of course, you have to do that. We will make sure that your article is being expressed in the best possible way, which means that when you submit it to Intellect for peer review, it might still get rejected, as I said earlier on, because it's either out of scope or it's just not right, or it doesn't somehow fit with the journal. But our evidence shows, and this isn't just with Intellect, but generally, a well-written paper, a paper that is, you couldn't tell whether it's a native English speaking author or not that's written the paper because it's so well written, is easier to review, and therefore that peer review decision should be easier as well. It might still get rejected. Hopefully it won't, but if it does get rejected, it won't be because of language. And then, the question is, okay, well, if it's been rejected for these reasons, what are the factors that we need to consider? And very often we get paper sent to us, again, not specifically Intellect here, but where the editor says, okay, we think there's something here. So as long as you make the changes, so subject to revision, as long as you make these language changes, these structural changes, as long as you perhaps present the paper in a better way, we submit it. But it's kind of decision pending, subject to revisions. And then there's also the author can send us the paper. So as long as they're aware the service exists, as long as they come to that landing page, then we'll just, we'll give them a competitive price that will then help them to submit. And the way it helps Intellect and publishers like Intellect is by ensuring that the content you receive is easy to review because it's so well written. That's kind of the major factor. So take away that whole language issue, which has been historically a real barrier. Admittedly now, because people are using more generative AI tools, some of that is being handled by these AI tools to an extent, but it's still riddled with errors and hallucinations, and you still need a professional editor to clean that up.
I completely concur. Well, look, thank you very much for sharing that. And maybe let's just talk about another practicality. You showed us the interface earlier, but if someone's listening to this and they're like, this is the service for me, I really want to check this out, find out a bit more, what's their best pathway to engage with Enago, especially if they want to publish in an Intellect journal? Would they come to you? Would they go through us? Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
On your journal instruction pages, there's a instructions for authors. And in those instructions for authors, it gives you tips in terms of how you prepare your manuscript and how you format the manuscript. And one of the blocks of text is around, well, look, if you need help with the English, we have an arrangement with Enago. Click on this link, and it takes you directly to the Intellect Enago homepage. So I think pretty much every Intellect journal will have a link to Enago within its instruction for authors.
Awesome. Okay. So yeah,
bookmark the page I showed earlier on, which is enago.com/pub/intellect.
And we will have that at the end of this podcast as well. To click on, of course, to find out a bit more information and to do a deep dive on Enago and their services.
And Intellect authors have been using the service.
They have. Which actually leads me on to my next question, which I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
Have there been any interesting recent projects that have, caught your eye when you've been looking through what's been submitted from Intellect authors? Because I know off camera we did. You mentioned a couple of things earlier, which was like, oh wow, yeah, I know that one.
I'm not an editor, so I don't edit the content. My job is working with publishers to help provide the workflows for them. But I do track the content that we get through, and we've had some really interesting papers. For example, I'm just thinking about my own sort of interest now. We've had authors submitting papers for journals like the Metal Music Studies, for example. There was an article looking at, I think it was indigenous metal music in indigenous groups in Latin America. We've also had articles on the Journal of African Media Studies, the Journal of Arab and Muslim Media Research. Again, looking at totally different aspects. There's lots of really. I think the Arab and Islamic Research Journal was funny enough, talking specifically about the use of integrating AI into Arabic podcasts, for example. So there's been a number of really interesting pieces. That's one of the things I love working with humanities publishers. There's some wonderfully esoteric topics that get covered.
And you know what? Just also for anyone listening here who's thinking about using these services and maybe is a little bit nervous in terms of they're worried about their own the quality of their own work and things like that, or like the quality of the journals that it might end up in. The journals you've just mentioned are actually some of our journals which have the highest impact factors or Imago ratings and rankings. So these are some of the journals that we publish that are most regarded internationally by the academic community and by various different indexes and various international metrics. So it does show just how important it is, and how that we're leveling the playing field, really, and how important.
And one word of advice in terms of this workflow is,
please.
If you're a researcher working in an institution, you're unsure how to fund this, it's always worth asking up the chain. It's always worth asking head of department. It's always worth asking head of research. It's always worth asking the library whether there are funds available to support authors that are, who are writing, submitting to a high impact journal, because those programs aren't always very widely promoted in universities. And yet we know hundreds of universities around the world, particularly in Asia, in South America, where these programs are in place. So it's not particularly widely communicated. And if you're an early career researcher, you won't necessarily be aware of some of the programs that have been introduced a year, 2 years ago. There's always asking.
That's a wonderful point, and you kind of beat me to the punch, because that was my next question. Obviously, there are costs involved in these services, and there's obviously the discount. I think we said 20%, for working with Intellect there. But I imagine, like many grants and things like that, they're there if you know where to look and what door to knock on. So that is a really good point. That it's probably worth going to the library. It's probably worth going to the research department, to various different places within the university, and seeing if there is any money available to fund these things, because it does physically benefit the institution, of course, as well.
And if the person you're talking to says, well, why don't you just go and use Gen AI to fix it, that comes with its own problems. You'll still end up having to get that paper edited, because even those tools are certainly far from perfect. Yeah,
and I think the more that we all use various different large language models and Gen AI tools, we're all starting to see the inherent shortcomings and problems and ghosts in the machine, as it were. So I think that is a really good point as well. And I think more and more people are, as useful a tool as AI is, and obviously Pandora is firmly out of the box. But at the same time, we do need to remember that it's not just a one-stop solution for every situation, and you do need to double check, fact check, and look at those references and just make sure it makes sense, for sure. So
not only is Pandora out the box, Pandora is creating her own boxes, and that's we have to be very careful.
So, true. Very good point. Very good point.
Use AI, but make sure those human guardrails are in place. But as I say, if you still need to have that content checked, which we see this now, for example, in countries like Japan, where there's a real obsession with quality. They might use a local AI tool to help them in the generation process, but it still creates problems. So they still end up using a company like us to clean it up and make sure it's being expressed and communicated as clearly and ambiguously and as effectively as possible.
Well, let me ask you a bit more of a sort of random question. You've had a lot of experience across the publishing world. So bearing in mind all of that wealth of depth of knowledge and experience that you've got from your career, is there one piece of advice that you would give to a researcher, just to help improve the publication quality of their work? Maybe they don't necessarily, it's not necessarily their first time submitting, but to a researcher who's looking to submit and be a successful published author, is there any one bit of advice that you would give that person?
One piece of advice, gosh.
And it doesn't have to be definitive, but just any advice that you think would be worth them.
The thing about the world that we operate in now, the amount of research that's being published, as we all know, is increasing exponentially. It's almost impossible to keep up with all the literature that's available in your own research area. So when you're submitting a paper, think about the title. How can you don't want clickbait, but you want the title to be as engaging as possible, and as reflective of the paper as possible, and still be something that you want that can be easily found. You want the content to be well thought through. You don't want to start that writing process until you've completed that research. What publishers don't want is that kind of it used to be called salami slicing publishing, where you might get like 6 papers, one for the methodology, one for the theory, one for the experiment, one for the conclusion, and one for a kind of review. 5 or 6 papers. Publishers don't want that generally.
No, don't be greedy.
avoid predatory journals. Make sure that the journal you're dealing with, if you're dealing with a company like Intellect, you've got no problems, because these are all highly professional, ethically managed journals. But there are a lot of bad actors out there. Avoid that. Be sure that the journal that you're submitting to is the journal that you want to submit to. Because there are a lot of organizations. If you're using AI, be honest about how you're using AI. How you're using it in terms of creating the content. Be absolutely clear and unambiguous in your disclosure statements. And don't be disappointed if you get rejected, because there's something like, we calculate something like 6 million, 6.5, 7 million submissions to academic journals worldwide every year, of which about 50 to 60% at best will be published. But that doesn't mean to say they won't eventually get published. It may just not be published in the first journal of choice. So, and then again, that's something else that will help with. If you need to prepare that article, if you get rejected from a humanities journal here and you need to submit it to another humanities journal, so it might go from A to Intellect, or from Intellect to someone else, we can help you prepare that content for the next part of your publication journey. So it's about patience, and it's not about speed, unless you're doing some kind of groundbreaking medical research, or something with a patent linked to it. It's about getting it right and taking your time and making sure that the article is well written and presented as it possibly can be.
Oh, well, thank you, Tony. That's saved advice there, and I agree with everything you've said, and some really, really important points there. I think the title, something I've been dealing with just this week, and it's something that comes up quite often, where people will maybe be prefer an evocative title, where that might not necessarily get you found and read and cited within the ecosystem that we have to work in.
Well, I'll give you an interesting sort of fact, is that I'd say about not quite a third, but maybe 25% of the submissions that we receive, not just Intellect, but across the board, don't have titles. They send us the article without the title. So please, suggest a title that we can use. It's a very high. I was surprised how high proportion it was, and that's something we can help with. And there is one other thing: we have a consulting service as well. So if you're not sure about how you're writing your title, we can put you in touch with a specialist. Unfortunately, there's no cost involved, but we can put you in touch with somebody. We can have a conversation to talk about how best to prepare your content.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. That's been really fantastic and fascinating chatting with you about Enago, those services, and of course that partnership with Intellect. But you're not quite off the hook yet, because I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast a few quick fire questions, just so we get to know who they are a little bit, who they are as a real human being, as a real person.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, if you don't mind, and I'll begin with a couple of musical questions. I think. Do you like music, and do you have any favorite genres of music?
Well, before I answer that question, I'm just going to turn my background off, and I think by turning my background off, I'll give you the answer to my question. Basically, what you can see behind me is walls and walls and walls of music. I mean, I've got books on music, I've got guitars behind me, I've got CDs. Over in another room, I've got thousands of records. So my love, if it's not my family, of course, is music. I spend a lot of time with music. I just spent the last week at a guitar boot camp in Gloucestershire, spending 5 days just playing the guitar. So that's my shed is music.
Oh, awesome. So you not only collect records, you're also a musician yourself.
I'm a budding amateur musician. Yeah, I play in various folk bands and folk orchestras in the Bristol area in the UK.
Oh, awesome. Well, what about favorite genres then? Is folk up there, or are there other things that you're
ironically, well, that's the stuff I play. It's not the stuff I listen to. I tend to listen to a lot of rock and hard rock, and
gotcha.
I like a bit of metal. I like a bit of modern jazz. So there are genres I don't listen to very much, but that's maybe an age thing. I don't listen to a lot of hip hop. I don't listen to a lot of that style of music, but don't listen to a lot of reggae. But I do listen to a lot of soul, R&B. Yeah,
it's each to their own. It's one of the most subjective things, and one of the best things to discuss because of the subjectivity, and everyone's got their different.
And thank God that we're not all the same. What a boring world it would be otherwise.
Indeed. Well, it sounds like you do buy quite a few records as well. Have there been any records in the last couple of months you've picked up that you've been like, oh wow, I've been looking for that one for a while, or anything that stands out to you?
Well, funny enough, one arrived today, which I've been looking forward to for a while, because I'm a huge fan of the Pink Floyd. Cool. And this is a new record by Roger Waters and the Pink Floyd, which is a live album from a show he did in Prague last year. A 4-disc set. Which I'm really looking. I'm not. It's still sealed. I've not even opened it yet. So I'm really looking forward to listening to.
Very cool, very cool. And where you live, are there many sort of actual brick and mortar physical record shops still, or is it mainly online that you're doing most of your purchasing these days?
I live just outside of Bristol in the UK,
Okay.
which I think you know quite well yourself, James.
Indeed.
And Bristol has a pretty good record scene. Not quite, it's not New York. It's better. I think it's better than London. I think there are better selections of shops in Bristol than there are in certain parts of London. So yeah, there must be a good. I go to at least once or twice a month. Good 10 shops somewhere in Bristol that will sell records. Yeah, but I do a lot online as well.
And how about favorite albums? Any from history? Any favorite albums?
Well, I was trying to tie this in. I was trying to tie this in with the kind of subjects that Intellect publishes. I was thinking, well, not just favorite. I've got lots of favorite albums, but one of my favorite soundtrack albums.
Okay.
There's a record from, I think it was from 1983 or 1984 by a film called One from the Heart, which is a Francis Ford Coppola movie. Beautiful, beautiful movie. One of these almost like life-changing films where it's not about the story. It's a very simple boy meets girl, boy falls out with girl sort of story. But the whole atmosphere, the sound, the lighting, the ambience of the film was just incredible. And I remember watching it late at night, and the music was by the American singer Tom Waits, who in itself is kind of he's a bit Marmite. It's love or hate, I love that growly voice. Or you don't. I kind of do. And so that soundtrack, the film One from the Heart, is probably my favourite soundtrack record.
Oh, awesome. Well, that's a blast from the past. I haven't seen that film for a long time, and I know there's plenty of. Yeah, like long ago, yeah. And I think plenty of our listeners and viewers will know the movie, or if they don't, I urge them to go and check it out.
Right, I'm sure your journals have carried articles on Coppola's work, and I consider that one to be an important one, just for the sheer beauty of the film in production.
Oh, brilliant. Well, on that note, I was going to say, you've piqued my interest because one of my favorite albums I've been listening to recently is a soundtrack record as well, but it's Curtis Mayfield's Superfly.
Oh, Superfly, yeah, that's a cracker.
Which I knew a load of the songs from my youth, and then years and years ago I bought the record on vinyl and was really made up to have it because it's like very cool, and it was one of my first funk records I kind of got into. I love Curtis Mayfield. But yeah, then I was like, I saw the movie, and it's one of those things where it's kind of like puts all the pieces together.
That and the theme track, the themes of the soundtrack to the film Shaft, Isaac Hayes, are kind of those two you always see hand in hand.
Yeah, and another one, the Black Caesar, James Brown is worth.
Oh yeah,
as well. There's plenty though from that blaxploitation kind of era, and there's definitely some Intellect articles about blaxploitation movies and soundtracks. If someone's out there hitting the keyword searches right now,
hopefully hugely important.
No, definitely. Well, and again, one of the things that we love at Intellect, and this is probably clear from the work that you receive at Enago as well, is interdisciplinary research around culture, music, fashion, filmmaking. So these things and how they interact are often really, really at the core of what we do.
And I was looking at the sort of papers that we receive and sort of the inquiries that we receive. I think we've had authors from about 25 different intellectual. I know you've got a lot more than that. You've got over 100 journals, but 25 different journals have already been sending us papers to help them with. So it's clear there's an interest, there's demand there. There may not always be the funding there, but we'll do what we can to help.
Oh. And look, let's talk a little bit about aesthetics for a second as well, because like I say, looking at these cultural artifacts, these texts, but from different lenses, you've highlighted a couple of favorite albums and shown us what you've recently acquired. Are there any like liner notes or album covers, album artworks that stick out to you as well?
Well, this will age me. I love the artwork of Roger Dean. Have you heard of Roger Dean?
I don't think I have actually.
Have you heard of the band? Yes.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
The band, yes, kind of cultural 70s progressive rock giants. And from 1971 onwards, they used Roger Dean's artwork, and Roger Dean created these sort of landscapes, these sort of future spacescapes. And he is so distinctive. You see a cover, a Roger Dean cover, and it's a Roger Dean cover. And it's been the only time in my life I've thought I'd love to. I haven't done it yet. I will, I'm sure, one day. I'd love to own either an original or a litho of one of those pieces of artwork, because they're iconic. So no one particular cover, but all of the early Yes album covers. There's a band called Green Slade as well, which I think used Roger Dean. Anything that Roger Dean puts his hand to is just a thing of beauty.
Brilliant. Oh, that you're making me think about an intellect book now, Landscape and the Science Fiction Imaginary.
Oh, there we go. I'm sure he's been covered in that.
It just shows you how much intersectionality there is that goes on in these cool topics. Well, thank you for sharing that. I've just a couple more questions for you. I do want to ask you a film one. I was wondering if there's any films that have been like really impactful on your life, any movies that kind of changed your life or changed your appreciation of cinema, anything that, you know, brought a tear to your eye, anything that really stands out from your life?
Well, I go back. I mean, it's not necessarily my favorite film, but certainly one of my favorite. I go back to One from the Heart. It was watching that film at 3 o'clock in the morning after a drunken night out in my 20s, and in a darkened room, and just seeing this completely beautiful sort of experience, beautiful film. I've seen so many films. I've got a friend, an old school friend, who's he writes film scores, film soundtracks. So I'm always very keen to sort of follow his work. And he did a lot of things like James Bond films in the noughties as well. So he's done very well. So I love that sort of that whole experience. But the one that's probably made the most mark on me, because I watched this film and just I had to go out the following morning, buy the record. I was the first person in the queue when it came out on VHS. In those days, you know. So that's probably one of my top 5 films.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask as well about, you know, with your role in Enago and also with different aspects of your career. It sounds like you've probably had the opportunity to travel a bit. So I was just wondering if you've traveled quite a bit. Do you have any favorite cities in the world? Anything that jumps out to you, and maybe just why they're so special to you?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've worked in academic publishing since the early 90s, and I've had to travel very widely, very extensively in that time. It's pretty easy to say the place I haven't been to than the place I have. I've not done an awful lot in Latin America. I've only been to Mexico, for example, and I've not done an awful lot in sub-Saharan Africa, so apart from South Africa. But basically, if there's a university, if it's in Europe, if it's in East Asia, if it's in Japan, not Russia necessarily, been a few in Russia, I'll have been there at least once or twice. I'm also, from an academic perspective, a Germanist. So I did my first degree in Germany. So I always love going back to Germany. Real soft spot for Germany. And I've done a lot of work with German universities, particularly in the 90s, a long time ago. Used to hugely enjoy going out to Japan. I kind of was confused. I was really confused when I first used to start going there. Again, late 90s, early noughties. And I used to go 2 or 3 times a year. We had an office in Japan when I worked at the Institute of Physics. Absolutely loved Japan. But I hadn't been back for about 10 years. Loved going to Japan. Loved going to Tokyo, to Osaka, Kyoto, Nara, all those fantastic cities. And just I mean, you try to explain to people how different it is. You can't even explain it until you go there, until you see it in practice. So I used to love going there. And China, I've been out quite wide, done a lot of traveling in China as well. Again, I wasn't sure if I liked it or not the first couple of times, but fell in love with the place after the first 3 or 4 visits. Brilliant people, really, really fun people to work with, and some super cities. So have I got a favorite place in the world? I'm also half Italian, so I like to go to Italy when I can. So I think if I had a favorite place in the world, it's Rome.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But that's maybe I'm biased because I said my mother was Italian, so we have a real soft spot for Italy.
Well, my wife's half Italian. Well, half Italian American, I should say. But yeah, okay. The other half.
We're more Italian than the Italians. Like I'm half Irish, half
That's
Italian.
That's true. They talk more about the old country than they do about this.
The Boston Irish are more Irish than the Irish.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. It definitely becomes a real part of the identity. But I've been fortunate to spend quite a bit of time in Rome over the years because we published the Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies.
Oh, really? Okay.
And it's one of the journals that it's based in. Part of it's based in Rome, so they have a conference there every couple of years.
Is that Rome 3 University or
it's at the American University in Rome, which is in Trastevere, basically.
Yeah.
So it's a great location. Tremendous food, lots of student culture around there, but then you walk down the hill and then down into kind of the more famous parts of Rome. And it's just wonderful, you know, finish the day at the conference and then walk down the hill in the dusk light, grab a snack, maybe, you know, you get a little grappa on the street corner or something, and then everyone's just out and about. It's just so much culture. And
I tell you, there's some really good record shops in Rome as well.
Yeah. Well, look, on that note, I think we'll call it a day. That was fantastic. So Tony O'Rourke, thank you so much for your time today, and we really appreciate the partnership. It's been wonderful working with Enago.
That's my pleasure, James. I really look forward to hearing from any of your authors, and in any way we can help them. Please visit the Enago Intellect site.
Wonderful. And we'll post a little bit of extra information on the end of the podcast for anyone out there who has listened to this and is interested in finding out more, checking out what Enago does, their services, maybe asking Tony a bit more about his record collection, or what folk songs he's learning next.
Yeah.
But for today,
can I make one very cheap, quick plug at the end of this, if I may?
Absolutely.
In fact, my colleague and I record a podcast at least twice a week. We've just recently recorded episode 94. And if you're interested in anything that impacts on the world of research communication, whether it's technology, whether it's policy, whether it's funding, the podcast is called Pub Shorts. And that's, if you just search for Enago Pub Shorts on YouTube, you'll see all previous 94 episodes. You need a couple of days free to watch the whole lot, but we invite you to have a look at Pub Shorts as well. Awesome,
and we'll tell you what we'll do. We'll put a link in the bio type thing. We'll put a link at the end of the podcast for that as well. Well, Tony, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Appreciate the final plug, and it's been wonderful hosting you on the In Conversation podcast. That's all for today. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to all of our listeners out there as well. We'll see you next time.